Hi, everyone, and welcome to National Distance Learning Week. Today is our last day, and this is our second to final presentation. So we have another one again at noon. I'm glad that you chose to join us today, and I'm sure you'll be interested to hear about our presentation topic from our terrific presenter. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stony Foote to you today. Stephanie is the Associate Vice President for Teaching and Learning and Evidence-Based Practice at the John Gardner Institute of Excellence in Undergraduate Education. Prior to joining the Institute staff in August of 2017, Stephanie was the founding director of the Masters of Science in First Year Studies, professor in education in the Department of First Year and Transition Studies, and faculty fellow for high impact practices at Kennesaw State University. Before joining the faculty at KSU, Stephanie served as the founding director of the Academic Success Center and First Year Experience at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. And she was the Associate Director for Student Orientation and Family Programs at Stony Brook University. Stephanie has taught in the HEA program for Stony Brook University since 2013. So clearly you can see lots of experience with first-year students, and we're so excited to have you here to share with us today. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And thank you so much for making space in your time day and to join us and to be a part of this presentation. I want to invite you all as we go through the presentation to use the chat to ask any questions, make comments, share with us things that you're doing in your own courses or in your professional practice to engage first generation students. So feel free to use that space. And if you'd like to unmute or come on camera, please feel free to do so at any point. So as Erin said, my name is Stony Foote, and I work at the Gardner Institute full-time, but I also teach part-time. I'm a lecturer in the Higher Education Administration program at Stony Brook University for more than 10 years now. And what I'm going to share with you all today is some of my research, but a lot that I've done in my own professional practice to design courses that I think are more responsive to the needs of first-generation students, but also more responsive to the needs of all of my students. So hopefully you'll leave this session with some ideas that you could apply in your own courses if you're teaching or in your own professional practice with students. I have put together a little wakelet because we only have 45 minutes together. There's an awful lot for us to cover, and we won't do the topic justice. We'll just scratch the surface with some of it. But I put together a resource wakelet for you. I'll put the link, the direct link in the chat. There's a copy of the slides in there. And then if you wish, you can use the QR code also to navigate to the wakelet. I use wakelets a lot still, something that I began using during the height of the pandemic to create collections of resources for my students. And I continue to use it because students tell me that it's a very accessible resource for them. And it's very easy on my part to put together. So I think there's at least a little bit of wakelet love out there, maybe still, or maybe on my part. So very quickly, these are some highlights in our time together. As I mentioned, I would love to hear from you all about the things that you're doing or things that you are thinking about, wondering about, maybe even struggling with as you're considering how best to meet the needs of your students, first generation or otherwise. But these are some of the main points in our journey together that I've planned. So we'll talk a bit about who first generation students are. And I understand this is monolithic, as we look at this category of student identity. So obviously we're not, again, doing justice to the individual stories, narratives, identities, or intersections of identities. But at least I think we can glean some ideas that can help us as we're thinking about creating these responsive practices both in and outside of our classrooms. Then we'll get into some examples of pedagogies and practices that have been designed specifically for first generation students and others that are very consistent with the responses that we want to have to first generation student needs. So then we'll move into a point where we'll begin to think about how we could apply some of this in our own professional practice, maybe even commit to doing some things over the next few weeks in our own courses or practice. And then we'll have plenty of time both throughout the presentation and at the end for Q&A. So I'll jump right into it. We'll talk first about some of the characteristics of first generation students. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is a quote that appears on the screen, if you're able to see the screen. And this quote has really resonated with me because I think it speaks to the enormous pressure that many of our first generation students face. There's an article that's linked in the resource Wakelet that I've created for you all. And the article from 2022, fall 2022, Inside Higher Ed, is about the efforts that Paul Quinn College is making to attempt a multi-generational approach to supporting first generation students, because they realize, as many of us have, that first generation students sometimes struggle because they don't have the family support necessarily built in that will help them to navigate the very complex systems of higher education that we have. And they feel significant pressure and responsibility. So the quote on the screen says, "We set up first generation college students to be heroes," and that's a lot of pressure. The reality of it is wealthy students aren't expected to lift their whole families out of economic insecurity. And yet that's what we find with many first generation students, especially those who come from rural communities. And whether or not we ourselves are teaching, working in a rural community, some of our students are coming from those communities. So they feel even more pressure. And then I also want to mention, something that's sort of implicit in this, and that's the shame sometimes that goes with the failure. So if first generation students don't experience success immediately, maybe in a chosen major or just initially in the college experience, they feel tremendous shame. And that's something that really stuck with me, both, as in my own experience going to college, but also in the years that I've worked with first generation, first year students, and many of them, because of that shame, are unlikely to seek out help. They are unlikely also to continue in higher education. So there's a lot of pressure associated with this particular population of students. In the Chronicle of Higher Education this week, there was an article, and this infographic comes from Inside Higher Education, a different piece that was published in 2022. But I think both the Chronicle of Higher Education article and this piece from Inside Higher Ed help us to begin to understand that first generation is oftentimes we refer to it as sort of in the monolith. It's a category that our institutions define in a particular way, and it may be in the level 4 way. So no one in the immediate or extended family has attended or attempted college, or it may be that, no one within your immediate family has completed college. But we often think of it as very black and white. But in reality, there are many students who feel these different experiences of first generationness. Even if they can't articulate them, we have to keep in mind that this is a much more complex identity than just, black or white again. So level 1 on this infographic shows parents or guardians have attended some college but have not completed college. So they may have, as a student coming into our institution, some sense of what college will be, or some aspects of navigational capital or social capital, which I'll talk more about in just a moment, but they may not have, that full support that they need, or the knowledge that they need to navigate, again, the complex structures of our institutions. Level 2, they may have siblings who have attended or completed college, but parents did not attend. So they may have some support or guidance, but maybe not throughout the entire family. So parents or family members or guardians may have expectations about, the students coming home or helping out with family responsibilities that may seem unreasonable or may feel unreasonable given the demands and pressures that they have within their experience as a college student. Level 3, extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins have attended or completed college, but parents or siblings did not. So there's some history within the family, but not within the, parental sibling unit. So again, I really like this because it helps us, and again, it may not be the way that students identify, but it helps us to see the nuances that exist within this experience. And obviously we can't design for everyone, specifically, but what we should be thinking about is how can we be responsive and how can we design for flexibility too? So how can we respond to what we know these students need? And then also how can we be flexible enough that we can meet them where they're at, knowing that, we don't know all the time what they need in every moment. So I mentioned navigational capital and social capital just a few moments ago, and they come from YASO's community cultural wealth model. And this is specifically designed around the research related to critical race theory and first generation students. And some of you may be familiar with this, but YASO's model for me has been a very important one because sometimes our thinking or ideology goes to the deficit sort of end of the spectrum. We think about how can we remediate students? How can we, fill the gaps in their learning and understanding? And while it's important for us to help students to fill the gaps in their own learning and knowledge, if we think about students from an asset-based perspective, it speaks to a mindset that's growth oriented. It helps in terms of their motivation, and from a faculty perspective and from an administrator or staff perspective, it's also helpful. So we're not moving into the situation where we're blaming students, but instead we're thinking about how can we create systems, structures that support students and also celebrate the strengths that they bring to our institution. So in the wakelet that I've created, you can read the entire paper, YASO's paper that explains all the different forms of capital, but essentially these forms of capital could be considered strengths that our students bring. So when we think about first generation students, what sort of linguistic capital do they have? Even if, they may, for some of them, they may come from communities where they're not necessarily speaking English as a first language, celebrating the language and linguistic styles that they bring to our institutions, to our classrooms can be a beautiful thing. It can be an important thing. It's part of their culture and identity. The family capital, the familial capital that they have, even if the support, as I mentioned, is not necessarily oriented in a way that we would expect, like taking a student on a college visit or, helping them to decorate their residence hall room. But many of them come from very rich communities where they have, families support in some form or another. It's just a matter of educating the family and the community about what this means to go to college and to be a college student. And the same thing is true with social capital, helping those social systems. They can be comprised of friends, acquaintances, and others who may not be going to college. And that's often one of the struggles that first generation students experience when they, go back home. They may be surrounded by friends from high school and younger stages who aren't in college and don't understand what it means. So all of these can help us when we're thinking about designing programs and services and even support within our courses for first generation students. The last thing I want to mention is navigational capital, because this one is very important, as we move forward in this presentation, but I also think it's a good place for us to sort of focus in terms of what we might do in an online environment for these students. So navigational capital, we may think that students come in, and they often do, first generation students, not having as much navigational capital because they're not as familiar with where to find things or how to access things or what the lingo is, our acronyms within higher education and within our institutions. So we could do a lot, and we already do a lot within Brightspace if we're teaching in online or blended formats to help our students navigate. But there's even more, I think, that we can do, and I'll give you some suggestions in just a few minutes when we get into the pedagogies and practices. But this is an area where we can really help first generation students to be successful, both in the initial transition to college and then further on as they progress. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is, I'm not sure in this space if anyone is teaching undergraduate courses, but there are undergraduate courses that we refer to as gateway courses. But even at the graduate level, there are courses within our programs that we teach. Like I teach student development theory, and that's very much a gateway course. You have to pass this course, in order to progress through the major. And there are outcomes that are associated with the program that are embedded in my course that I teach. So it's very much a gateway. It's a significant course. And if you look at these courses sort of in the context of higher education, especially at the undergraduate level, these are often the courses that have the highest enrollments, the highest rates of D's, F's, withdrawals, and incompletes. I mention these courses because they're not bad courses, but they are high risk courses for students, and oftentimes for first generation students and for students from other historically marginalized identities, because these students are more likely to be affected by grades of D's, F's, withdrawals, and incompletes. So for example, if I'm a first generation student, if I look at the national data, I'll see that I'm more likely to not persist if I earn a D, F, or withdrawal, or an incomplete in a gateway course. It's just representative in the data. So I know that these courses are important for all students, but especially for students who are from these various identities. So when we think about what we can do, we have to confront these courses. We have to think especially about these courses that are sort of the linchpins within the experience of our students. And that's why, for me personally, I'm very motivated to do as much as I can in my HEA 502 course, because I know that if students are successful in that course, if they make it, if they make, you know, an A or a B in my class, they're going to make it through the program. And so I know that, you know, everything that I can do in the course to help support them and help them build their skills will be helpful to them as they move through the program. And they'll be able to move through the program if they're successful in my class. So some of what I've just referenced is explained further and more in an annotated bibliography that I contributed to a couple of years ago, and it's an open source publication. So I wanted to share it with you. It's in the Wakelet. It's linked in the resource Wakelet. It's a publication from the Center for First Generation Student Success, which is part of NASPA. So if you're interested, please feel free to check that out. There's a lot more literature that's annotated there about first generation students and all of the different aspects of their development, as well as some of the pedagogies and practices that I'll highlight in just a moment. So this will be a very quick reflection, but I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about this. So what is it that you know about your first generation students that you teach or work with? Are there things that you know about them and their needs? And if anyone has anything that they would like to share, feel free to do so in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, and I'd be excited to hear from you. And if anyone has joined us after the presentation began, let me go ahead and put the link to the resource Wakelet in the chat again. And there's a copy of the slides, and everything that I'm referencing is also linked in there.
So I know, Stephanie, sometimes the experience itself of what the requirements are, you know, from kind of just even self-regulation, self-discipline, the things to know about how to find resources, where those resources even can be. It's hard to know what you need if you don't kind of have any context that you're coming in from.
Exactly. That is one of the greatest challenges, right? So that's something that we can help first generation students to develop the understanding initially, and also throughout our courses. There are a few different ways I think that we can help support them. On some of the examples that I'm going to give will speak to that. I'm also glad you mentioned self-regulation, Erin. That's one of the things that we can teach our students, and it's included in the practices section that I'll get to in a moment.
It's a comment from Allison. Oh, go ahead. You said.
Yeah. Allison says in the chat, the intimidation they feel when being in a course with students fresh out of high school tends to affect their experience and confidence in class. They have the thought process that younger groups know more than them. And I find that to be the case very much in the courses that I teach. You know, even though I'm teaching at the graduate level at Stony Brook, I have a lot of returning adult students who have been out of school for 20 years or 30 years. And they are feeling a lot of imposter syndrome and are very concerned that they won't be able to keep up with the students who are coming directly out of undergrad. So that is absolutely a very real feeling for them. Loy mentioned lack of knowledge of their student rights as well as responsibilities. And I would absolutely agree with that. That is something that is often unknown for students who have who are coming in as first generation. All right, you all please continue to share. I'm going to move into the next section, and don't worry, we'll have lots more opportunity for interaction. I want to share with you all some pedagogies and practices, and again, I'm going to go through these quite quickly, but what I would love to hear from you is if you are using any of these ideas in your own courses or in your professional practice, And then also, if you are using other strategies and approaches that have worked particularly well for first generation students or for other students from historically marginalized populations. So again, I'll move through these quickly. Information about each one of them is linked in the resource booklet that I've created. And please do share as well if you're using any or if you're using other approaches that are working particularly well. So one of the things that I have found to be so incredibly important, not just with first generation students, but with all students and not just undergraduates, but graduate students as well, is this idea of humanized pedagogy. And this began to emerge, during the pandemic as we were thinking about how can we create these online experiences that are humanized. And for me, this really hit home because I've been teaching online for a very long time. I've also taught face-to-face. I've taught blended or hybrid classes as well. But I think that this has become very important to me because I want to make sure that my students feel like they can, be supported in my class and be successful, and that who they are is very important, and that I'll do everything in the course to support them, their growth and their learning. And so it's important to acknowledge that there are things that are, built in the structures in which we're teaching that are reinforcing sometimes, these worldviews about the limitations that they might have or feel. And so there are things that we're constantly working against, within the systems. But I can do a lot in my own courses to help my students feel safe and to feel as though they belong. And this is particularly important for first generation students. And if we're teaching in online or blended spaces, I think it's of particular importance. So with that in mind, this is also from Michelle Pacansky-Brock. She's quite well known in terms of humanizing online courses, and she's somebody that I look to all the time and have been very influenced by her work. She has this definition of, how and why we might humanize our online courses and what it means to humanize. And you can read more about this. It's linked in the resource booklet. But what I want to call your attention to is on the left-hand side of the screen. These are things, practices that we can incorporate not only in our courses, but also in our own professional practice with students. And they work in online experiences, but also in face-to-face experiences too. Very simple principles. She's articulated first is trust. So as an instructor, obviously, we want students to trust us. We want students to trust each other. In an online environment, it can sometimes look a little bit different to try to work toward creating trust, but it is a very important aspect of teaching and learning, especially when we think about students who are coming to us with a lot of uncertainty, who may feel as though they don't belong necessarily and are questioning themselves and their abilities. So it's very important to try to cultivate that trust. Presence, of course, having some presence in our course, but not, being dominant, but making sure that our presence is known, that instructor presence is something that, we want to achieve, but we also want students to feel the presence of each other as well. Awareness, so knowing more about our students and their needs and responding to them is very important and can be a little bit trickier sometimes in an online environment. But I'll share with you some of the ways that I am able to do that actually coming up next after this slide. And then, of course, empathy. And that's something that I've worked a lot on myself. I always felt like I was a very empathetic instructor, but, just sort of changing some communication and even changing some design within my courses has really helped to communicate that empathy to my students. And I'll give you an example of that also in just a moment. So on that note, let me give you that example. So one of the things that I've done, and this is very inspired by the work that I was doing when I was doing some research on first generation students, I was thinking about communicating belonging. And, I wanted to really find ways, on day zero, to be even more proactive about communicating belonging. So I created a liquid syllabus, and I see that Erin put, thank you, in the chat, a link to Michelle Pacansky-Brock's, some of her work on humanizing online teaching and learning. Michelle is also sort of a visionary when it comes to this idea of the liquid syllabus. And in the Wakelet that you have, there's some more details about liquid syllabi. But what I did was I thought on day 0, I want students to really understand that they belong here. They belong in my class, they belong at the institution. And so I created some different statements, that I included in the liquid syllabus. These also are in my traditional syllabus, in addition to the statements that I have to include about the course, those boilerplate statements for the department that I teach in and from the institution. But the statement of inclusion was really important. And this is one that is different in all the courses that I teach. So this one in particular is from the student development theory class that I teach. And I know that sometimes in the class, students will they'll be struggling, with some of the theories and models that we study, and while they're learning about them, they're learning things about themselves and their own identity. So there are times when we may, wonder about something, or we may have a question, we may ask something that isn't, exactly stated correctly. We all make mistakes, we're all learning. And so it's important to understand that, we can very much in this class be a work in progress, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable to ourselves, to each other within the course to create a safe space. So it's important for us to understand difficult conversations may need to happen, they may happen, and we have to confront them and do so with kindness. And so this is sort of the first step in articulating that. During the height of the pandemic, even though I was already teaching online and didn't have to transition to the online learning environment, I still felt it was important to write a statement about the moment that we were in and how we would center our course that I was teaching around the students. Students first. Your health, wellness, and well-being are most important in this course, even more important than the content that's being taught. So the statement has evolved, and now I have in my liquid syllabus and in my traditional syllabus the statement of teaching and learning in 2023. And I think I'll continue to do this because ultimately this is really what my philosophy is. I think it's important that students know that that they are the most important thing, and that there are things that are always happening in the world and in our lives that will take priority at times over this class. And I understand that. And we're going to prioritize our humanity, our physical and mental health and well-being. And, we're going to provide an environment where, they feel connected to each other, and where they feel like, if they have to take a moment away, that it's okay and they can come back to the community. So these have been ways that have been inspired by thinking about how to communicate belonging from, again, day 0. Erin posted a question in the chat. Do others here use elements of a liquid syllabus, welcome video, learning expectations, what students need to know for week 1, using welcoming and inclusive language, etc.? Those are all sort of components of a liquid syllabus. If you're not using a liquid syllabus, you might consider one, or you certainly could consider any combination of these things that Erin has put in the chat. The idea behind the liquid syllabus is that it's a living syllabus, so it's a lot more dynamic. And I'll give you a couple of examples in just a moment of things that I do in the liquid syllabus to make the course more accessible to my students. And to further explain expectations about assignments and how feedback will be given. So I'll share with you some more tangible examples of that in just a few minutes. What's on the screen right now is not necessarily a practice that is specific to the needs of first generation students, but it helps to meet their needs and needs of all of the learners in our classes. These are the Universal Design for Learning guidelines, and I know that that there's some great workshops coming up. I think there's one coming up really soon, a SUNY workshop that's coming up on this topic. So there are a lot of ways we can learn more about it if you're not already familiar with the UDL, Universal Design for Learning guidelines. But the way that I use these in my own courses, in my online courses that I teach, there are these sort of three columns, and you'll see the first one has to do with engagement. So this is the why of learning. The second one has to do with representation, so multiple means of representation. That's the what of learning. And then the third is action and expression, which is the how of learning. So in my own courses, in my online courses, I think a lot about different approaches to engagement. So I actually refer to there's an online engagement framework that I use quite regularly that helps me to identify different forms of engagement. So we're thinking about cognitive engagement, behavioral engagement, social engagement. So when I design interactions and activities in my courses, I'm keeping in mind all of these different forms of engagement and looking to find ways to advance that within the context of my class. And I think that this has been very important because students know that engagement is not just in the discussion board. There are a lot of other ways that they can become engaged with each other within the context of the course and with me as well. Multiple means of representation for me in my online courses means inviting my students to be discussion leaders with me. So they choose a week to be a discussion leader. And we have a couple of discussion leaders, no more than 3 in any one week. And we work together and come up with discussion questions. They become experts essentially in the area of theory that we're studying that week. And then they help to facilitate the discussion. But part of that facilitation is to bring in additional readings, videos, examples that speak to the theory or model that we're studying that week. And so this ensures that we have lots of different forms of representation because these students are bringing, new examples that are different from those that I would have found on my own. And they're bringing in more contemporary examples sometimes, or maybe even more traditional examples. But we have such a wide variety, a rich variety of things that, we bring as discussion leaders and can share. So that adds to all of the things that I'm providing to my students in terms of examples, supplemental resources. But it has been a really rich experience, and the students get a lot of joy from it because they are becoming an expert in something, but they also feel supported throughout the way because I'm there for them. We work through the discussion questions ahead of time, and then I help them with that facilitation. And then lastly, the multiple means of action and expression. In my online courses, this means that in many cases, I provide students with opportunities to choose an assignment or activity. So they have options. They can do A, B, or C. And I think it's important, what I've found, especially now, because students are dealing, just as we're dealing with issues of cognitive load, to not have too many options, but to have a few. And then to leave the door open. So if a student wanted to suggest another option, something that they wanted to do for an assignment, that they could. And every once in a while, I do have a student who will come to me and say, I have an idea, and can I do this? And 99.9% of the time, they can do it. So I think that this has become really important. Whenever possible, I try to give options to allow them to create some learning artifact or some expression of their learning that's authentic to them and still also authentic to the outcomes and assignment in the assignment. The next thing that I do thank you, Erin, put the SUNY UDL workshops and resource information in the chat. The next thing that I do in my own courses, my online courses, and again, this is very helpful as we're getting to know our students as we're finding out who they are and how they identify. So we may not know that some of our students identify as first generation, but this is an info sheet, and I know you can't read it on the screen, but it's linked in the Wakelet that I've created for you. There's information in here about, on the left-hand side, there's an article about how to do this in your classes. You may already do a version of this. I've used a version of this for a long time. But what I love about the article is that it explains how we as instructors can respond to what we're learning about our students. And it gives some very tangible strategies and approaches. And the sheet, the info sheet, is where we can find out, do you identify as, or is there anything you'd like to tell me about your educational background or about your preferences, things that you hope I do as an instructor or that I don't do? What are your hopes and fears related to this class or related to the program? They will tell you, students will tell you a lot, but we have to know more about who they are to be able to meet their needs. So it's very important to find a way to, whether it's through an initial discussion board where you're inviting them to tell more about themselves, or an activity or assignment like this, where they're sharing some of this information. So that way we can design, even in the moment, to meet their needs. And I'll give you an example of how I've done that. So I found out through a version of the information sheet that I sent out a few semesters ago that some of my students had food insecurities. And so even though this is an online class, I was still able to provide them some information about the food pantry, both on campus and then the local community. So that was a way to help support them as I was learning that there were issues, related to their ability to access and secure food. The same is true for housing insecurity, but even on a sort of a more minor kind of level, I find out all the time in these info sheets that my students are afraid of like APA formatting. And in my course and in the program that I teach in, that's one of the things that they have to learn to do is to format using the APA citation format. And so when I learn things like this, I can put together resource wakelets or other resources and send them out to students, post them in Brightspace and also share them in other formats with the students. And it's been very helpful because I learned this information early on and can start, putting these things together. And it doesn't take very much time or effort on my part. Another approach that I think is so important, it has become very important in my own professional practice, and this is specific to work with first-generation students, is this idea of critical compassionate pedagogy. And it comes from passionate communication, which has been around for a while. There are 4 components of it. It has become, for me, a way to be reflective in my own teaching. So the components are observation, feeling, need, and request. So what I do as I'm teaching a course is, before rushing to do anything, I'm observing, I'm taking into consideration what's happening. I'm not making any judgments. So if, for example, a student is not participating in class or is doing a very poor job in class, I'm not making any judgments about them, but I'm observing and collecting the evidence and really thinking through, what is it that's happening and looking at, what I might be doing. Then I'm going through this process of identifying my own feelings and reactions. And then I'm thinking about and helping to connect the needs to the feelings. So I'm reaching out to my students to find out what their needs are and opening up the channels for communication. So I'm asking students, I'm not saying, why didn't you do this assignment or exam, but I'm saying, how can I help you to do this? Or what help might you need to do this? Do you need extra time? And oftentimes that's all it is. The student just needs extra time. They felt very rushed and they just need more time to do something. But it's really helped me to reframe my own thinking about how I'm going to communicate with students. And that's especially important in the online environment because we don't have the ability in the moment to take something back or to restate something. When we communicate with students, it's often in a written format, or maybe it's in a recorded file or a video. But, we have to be very careful about the framing because it really sticks with them. And I think it speaks a lot to whether or not they trust us and whether, they feel safe within the context of our courses. So this is a very helpful approach, or at least it has been for me. We have just 2 really quick practices that I want to highlight. And again, these are tangible that you could begin doing right away. This particular approach is one that I feel has really transformed my courses. And it's something actually that I begin in the liquid syllabus. So it's called TILT, Transparency in Learning and Teaching. And it's an approach that there are a lot of examples out there on the website. It's linked in the resource wakelet on how to tilt assignments, how to tilt classes. But what I do is I take this framework, the TILT framework, which is literally purpose, task, and criteria for success, and I apply it to all of the assignments and activities in my course. And so everything that I ask my students to do, I present to them as this. So I say, here it is, here's the assignment, this is the purpose, and I have 1 to 2 sentences that explain the purpose. Here's the task. The task is no more than 1 paragraph. Usually it's 2 to 3 sentences. And then the criteria for success are very clearly stated and linked to a rubric. So I do this in the liquid syllabus. So all of the assignments before the class even begins are clear to them. And then when they get into the learning management system, when they get into Brightspace, they can see, again, in the assignment area, I've articulated the exact same thing. So they see the purpose, task, and criteria for success. The first time I implemented this, which was now about almost 2 years ago, I had so few questions. Like there were no questions after I sent everything out to my students about any of the assignments or activities that I thought something was wrong. I wondered, did they get it? Is something going on? Because usually there would be, one or two questions at least. And then as we got closer to the assignments, many more questions. But I found that this has vastly reduced the number of questions. It's also just made for me um, the the communication process. It's reduced the noise sort of in the assignments. I used to, in my assignment guidelines, have lots of information and lots of examples. And I thought that that was a good thing, but I realized that from a cognitive load perspective, it was difficult for my students to really narrow in on what it is that I wanted them to do or be able to do as a result of this assignment or activity. So this has been transformative for me. And again, I start in the liquid syllabus and carry it throughout. And I also have now used this sort of format as a kind of a loose frame for the feedback that I give my students. The last thing that I wanted to mention is this idea of self-regulated learning theory, self-regulated learning rather. It is something that's good for all students. It's a process that students can become familiar with and can use, but it's also very effective, as you'll see on the screen, if you can see the screen, with first generation students. So this references research involving first generation STEM students who used self-regulated learning, this process and cycle, and the outcomes, were very positive in terms of their course performance. We don't have enough time to dig completely into this, but I would be very happy to talk with you offline if you're interested in it. The idea behind it is based on Zimmerman's cycle, and that's on the left-hand side of the screen. And you can see it's a pretty simple approach. It's also hyperlinked in the resource bank that I've created for you, but it starts with this idea of planning. So students would actually go through the process of, planning how they're going to approach an assignment or activity, maybe even, coming up with a schedule. And then they would move into a process of monitoring and actually acting. So they're doing the thing and checking in on how they're doing periodically. And then they're moving into a process where they're regulating and controlling. So they're making tweaks and changes and making sure that, things are staying on track and on progress. And again, that they're remaining accountable to themselves. And then at the end, and this is the key, this is where the metacognition also really comes into play, is that they're reflecting and reacting. So many times students don't reflect on the process that they've used to get to where they are, in terms of an assignment activity or even an exam. And we have to prompt them, that's an important part of this process, to reflect back on what you did and what worked and what didn't work and what you would do differently. And there are a lot of different ways to approach that, but, just helping students, reminding them to reflect and to think about, take time and space to think about it can be very valuable too. At this point, I want to move into, in our last minute together, some opportunity for open discussion and to think about how you might use some of the ideas that you have heard about today, or again, some of the things that you're doing that have been particularly helpful for your own work, your professional practice, or teaching with first generation students. And Erin has put a resource. The SUNY Online Teaching Unit has developed a resource with learner to support learner success that has a number of the strategies in it that I need to check that out myself, that we've highlighted today. But I'd love to hear from you all about things that you're doing, things that you've heard today that maybe you will do in the future.
Yes, please, by all means, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat if you're more comfortable. I know some folks are talking about the things that they do at the beginning of the class, sort of along the lines of when we were talking about a liquid syllabus, right? So introduction videos, welcome videos, and in the announcements, those are all wonderful strategies. And sometimes I think it takes people a little bit to get comfortable with posting a video, right? But I love that part about how it doesn't have to be perfect. It's your imperfect video that helps students feel comfortable. It shouldn't be polished and lovely like that.
No, I have a one take rule myself. One take. And clearly I'm not an actor, so it's never perfect.
So thoughts or comments from others? And thank you for those who did share in the chat. Stephanie, you've provided us with a lot of resources to be able to go back and look over in that Wakelet. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
It's great to walk away with something that you can, go back to and really kind of spend time examining. Good, thanks, Lisa. Okay, well, I reposted the link just so that you have it again. I love Wakelet. There used to be a tool called Bundler, which did the same kind of thing, and it no longer exists. So I'm going to check this out because I've been looking for something that would do this, where you can not only post your slides, but all these other ancillary resources, in these little thumbnails so that people can access them.
It's great. It's something that I learned from our K through 12 teachers, again, during the height of the pandemic. And it's just been a great resource to me, and I use it in all my classes.
It's awesome. I'm going to start using it in some of my other trainings too, because that's exactly what I used to use the other resource for, is to have a handout to take away, right? A digital handout, essentially.
Yeah, maybe a digital goodie bag.
Right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining, for your participation today and your attention, and all of the great suggestions that you've shared in the chat. I want to thank Stephanie, as always, for her expertise and for sharing the great work that you are doing with our SUNY colleagues. I posted 2 links. The first link is to our National Distance Learning Week sessions with access to slides and recordings there. The second link is to USDLA, who hosts and sponsors National Distance Learning Week, and they promote SUNY online webinars on a national level. So that is really exciting. We do have a 12 o'clock session. I will leave the Zoom room open. If anyone wants to stay here, you're more than welcome. We'll just be muted until that time.